The Senate votes to let our military detain Americans indefinitely. White House threatens veto. What is Obama going to do? The Senate voted today to keep a controversial provision to let the military detain terrorism suspects on U.S. soil and hold them indefinitely without trial, prompting White House officials to reissue a veto threat. The measure, part of a massive National Defense Authorization Act, was also opposed by the civil libertarians on the left and the right. Of course, Ron Paul and Rand Paul, his son, were very much, not Ron Paul, but Rand Paul, as far as the Senate's concerned, was very much against this. He aimed to kill it with a amendment he put forth, but that was turned down, and he did not get very far with that. The head of the Japanese American Citizens League warns that this has echoes of World War II-style internment without charge, kangaroo courts. It's pretty scary, and the pretext to all of this, without a doubt, has been 9/11. Just as the Patriot Act was put forth with 9/11, the clever backdrop, this is 10 years later now, more of the same, with even more draconian of rules and regulations coming after us. Welcome to the police state, folks. It's the year 2011, November 29th, and here we are, folks, on the Bob Tuskin Show. Pretty scary stuff. Never thought I would be reporting this. Well, I take that back. I could only imagine what was going to happen. Anyways, on tonight's show, we have Joshua Blakeney. And Joshua, you have such an extensive background that I'll let you go ahead and introduce yourself to our listeners that may not know you, and then we'll jump right into talking about all this news that's on the table.
Well, it's great to be back on your show, Bob. So for your listeners who don't know me, I'm Joshua Blakeney. I immigrated from England to Canada in 2005, in April 2005, and by 2006 I was enrolled in a sociology degree at the University of Lethbridge, which led me to take as an elective class Professor Anthony J. Hall's Globalization Studies classes. And as I entered his class, he was going through a revision and revisiting the literature on 9/11, and at that time became a 9/11 skeptic, came to the conclusion, around 2007, 2008, that the official story of 9/11 appears to be false. And so by the time my undergraduate degree culminated, Professor Hall and I had conspired together to implement a master's program for me where I would address what did and did not happen on 9/11 in my graduate studies. And so that's what I'm pursuing right now. I'm in the second year of my graduate studies. The working title of my thesis is The Origins of the Global War on Terror, Intellectual Debates and Interpretive Controversies. And so as a result of me studying 9/11 and winning a prestigious scholarship, the Queen Elizabeth II Graduate Scholarship, I've been getting attacked and assailed in the national media in Canada. I've been getting attacked by the likes of Jonathan Kay, who many of your listeners probably know. He's the chap who authored the hit piece on the 9/11 truth movement entitled Among the Truthers, a journey through the conspiracist underground of 9/11 truthers, birthers, and vaccine hysterics, in which he seeks to lump together disparate theorists and theories in order to dismiss a whole swathe of skeptics who are drawing attention to the crimes of those in the elite. I was very pleased with your introduction, Bob, because I'm feeling a bit down because I've just watched one of my friends at Occupy Calgary, a brave Blackfoot young lady named Sarah Scout, who had gone to Occupy Calgary to the Olympic Plaza in downtown Calgary and had erected a teepee. And I gather upon speaking to a police officer in a way, or a peace officer rather, in a way that the officer didn't like, she's been apprehended, and my friend luckily caught it on camera, the police bundling her into a wagon to take her away. It's not very good scenery, seeing an indigenous person being manhandled by two strapping police officers, one of whom had an English accent like me, which makes me particularly sad, because one would think emigrating to North America, you should try to do your best to contribute to improve the place rather than contribute to the prolonged and consistent oppression of the indigenous peoples that started in 1492, but which became more pronounced in Canada with the passing of the Indian Act in the late 19th century. And so I'm, my professor, Anthony Hall, has a background in Native American studies, and so I've been fairly well schooled on the issues pertaining to Canada's indigenous peoples. In fact, I first came to North America because my mother was doing an MA degree to do with Indians. So my first exposure, whereas most of my friends from the UK, their first exposure to North America was coming to Disney or Universal Studios, my exposure was living on the Blackfoot Indian Reservation at age 14, 15, 16, 17. Among the indigenous people in Montana, and so I got to see the drug addictions and all the downsides, but also all the good sides of
the same thing is done with the Native Americans here. That we see all the alcoholism and whatnot, and many people don't realize this, Joshua, but the genocide that has taken place towards the Aboriginals and the Native Americans is quite atrocious. We've had Kevin Annett on the show, another Canadian who's very much involved, who I'm sure you know, and he's exposed the Vatican's influence in all this. But before we digress, because nothing's off the table tonight, I want to go back to this story that's making headlines, and a lot of this has to do with your root of your thesis, which is 9/11. And I want to get your take. I don't know how much you've gotten to read up on this, but how have we gotten from a massive event of trauma-based mind control that propelled people into this state of fear so that they could then crack down on us with the old Hegelian dialectic problem, reaction, solution, to now 11 years later, more of the same, and not just from the fear of 9/11, but from all of these things combined, it seems, all of the history of false flag terror. I mean, it's just accumulating now to the point where are we going? I mean, are we going to see SOPA get passed next and crack down on the internet? I mean, how far is this going to go, and what's your take on it?
Well, the 19th century is characterized by working class people getting mobilized and organizing, which crystallized, of course, in the Russian Revolution in 1917, where workers actually seized control of the state, albeit led by a rather dubious vanguard party. And so with the rise of the communist bloc, the capitalist countries, they had to actually kind of be somewhat nice to the working class, because there was always the fear that if the working class don't feel some vested interest in the capitalist mode of production, in the kind of liberal capitalist model that North America particularly embodied, that they might overthrow it. And so we saw, the New Deal as one sort of way of trying to, bring trade unions to the table, save capitalism and prevent capitalism from morphing into communism during the period of the Depression. Of course, an alternative model of saving capitalism that was very much liked by many members of the U.S. elite, like Charles Lindbergh and Henry Ford, was the Hitlerian model of capitalism, in which you enslaved you enslaved vast swathes of the working class and demonized, Slavs and Jews and Gypsies in order to revive the capitalist system that was in depression in Germany through chattel slavery in labor camps.
Well, when we get back here, Josh, because I opened up a can of worms, not realizing how close we were to the break, but when we get back, we'll talk about that. Joshua Blakeney is our special guest tonight on the Bob Tuskin Show. And Joshua, you were painting us a picture before we got cut off by the break, and you mentioned that capitalists, as you put the capitalist class, were taking advantage of the useless eaters, or goyim. What do you mean by the capitalist class? Because you seem to be pigeonholing capitalism as a major part of the problem. Let me see if I'm understanding you with this.
By the capitalist class, I mean the class of individuals who control and own capital, and that would be the capital that's produced by the working class. And so in capitalist society, working class people create capital. But we don't have a class-less society where those who produce capital enjoy the fruits of their labor. We have a class of parasites that sit on the necks of the workers who usurp that capital that's not produced by them. The people who work the hardest in capitalist society enjoy the fruits of their labor the least. And so the point I was developing was trying to provide some historical context to describe and explain how it was that we got where we are today. And I was saying basically that during the period where there was communism or the Soviet bloc or some alternative to the global capitalist order, those capitalist elites, those in the ruling class in countries like Britain and France and the US and in the non-communist countries during the Cold War had to be at least a little bit benevolent, a little bit liberal. They couldn't be too oppressive of the workers, because if they were, they knew that they might turn to the socialist bloc, the communist bloc, for sponsorship and support. And so basically our parents' generation had it a lot better than us as a result. When the Soviet Union imploded and when the communist bloc dissipated, the global capitalist class had no obstacle to the globalization of their capital, for them offshoring to get cheap labor in other parts of the world. As Charles Krauthammer wrote in 1990, as the Berlin Wall had just come down and the Soviet Union was imploding, he wrote a very significant essay in Foreign Affairs in 1990 called The Unipolar Moment, that the US had to capitalize on this unipolar moment that they had in the world, and that's what we've seen. And so as a result of the liberalization of capitalism, of capital, of those who own capital, who are no longer confined to the nation state, they've been able to go overseas and exploit other people's resources, other people's labor, whereas in the Cold War there would have been the Soviet Union there to sponsor the underdog and, of course, act as some kind of stabilizer on the planet. You know, a bipolar world is a lot better than a unipolar world. That shift in the geopolitics of the world manifests itself domestically in the United States, whereas during the Cold War, working class people at least had to feel some vested interest in the system, some investment in the system. Once there was no threat of an alternative to globalized capitalism, the ruling class have felt no need to be benevolent, no need to provide basic amenities, education, healthcare, decent prisons, a decent standard of living, or at least an elementary standard of living for working class people. And so when you ask how is it that we got in this police state, really the end of the Soviet Union, which I think has been disastrous for the planet. I mean, you read Nelson Mandela's biography, you read any of the ANC's biography, and they were very nostalgic and very grateful for the way that the Soviet Union acted and always sponsored the underdog, while the United States in the Cold War invariably sponsored racist, reactionary, white supremacist governments in Africa, for example, brutal dictators in Latin America and in the Middle East, whereas the Soviet Union invariably sponsored the underdog, Patrice Lumumba, Fidel Castro, those who were decolonizing and engaged in a struggle against imperialism were the ones who were sponsored by the Soviet Union, whereas the most reactionary and misanthropic dictators the planet's ever seen were the best friends of the US and of Israel and of Britain and of the imperialist countries. There's politicians right now in the British Parliament, for example, who 20, 30 years ago used to sit wearing T-shirts in the British Parliament saying, "Hang Nelson Mandela." And there are photos of them from university in previous incarnations wearing T-shirts saying "Hang Nelson Mandela." And so that I've kind of gone around the houses, but I think perhaps it's useful to provide a bit of historical context that our generation have this overt and unabashed class warfare being visited upon us by a ruling class who are unfettered, as wasn't the case during the Cold War. And so 9/11, of course, provided a fraudulent trigger incident. It was a fraudulent trigger incident that unleashed the ruling class to be unfettered in their imperialistic quest for domination around the world. And particularly the Zionist power configuration. I'm stealing a phrase from James Petrus, a sociologist whose work was required reading during my undergraduate degree. The Zionist power configuration, the faction of the ruling class who really want the Middle East to be smashed up and destabilized. So Israel's enemies will be weakened and destabilized and won't be able to stand up to the Israeli hegemon in the Middle East. So Israel will be able to retain regional hegemony rather than be threatened by the likes of Saddam Hussein, who fired Scud missiles at Israel in 1991, for example, that faction of the ruling class seemed to have been the most deeply complicit in the origins of the war on terror. And as a result, it's incumbent upon one to draw attention to that highly inhumane agenda that's being visited upon the people of the Middle East. And so in my research, I'm particularly unique perhaps in the respect that I have a background in the Israel-Palestine conflict. I founded a group called Solidarity for Palestinian Human Rights, a chapter of a pan-Canadian group we have in Canada that seeks to uphold the human rights and promote the Palestinian cause on Canadian campuses. And I used to compartmentalize Palestinian matters and 9/11 matters in my mind, but as I investigated the 9/11 incident more and more, I realized that these weren't two separate subjects, that they in fact overlapped considerably. And so I attempt to pressure those in the pro-Palestinian movement to speak out on the reality that Israel was deeply complicit in the slaughter of 3,000, mostly Caucasian, I emphasize, 3,000 mostly Caucasian individuals in New York City on 9/11. If we want to get the U.S. public to empathize with the Palestinians, we can talk about local issues in Israel-Palestine, but unfortunately Arabs and Muslims have been dehumanized in the eyes of the American people thanks to the media.
The media bias is just out of control, especially when it comes to Israel. And I ran into the head organizer, Mohammed, at my local Students for Palestine group, and we talked. And I asked him, I said, I'd like to give a talk one day, because I happen to come from a Jewish family, but I'm very much considerate to the Palestinian cause and so on. And I do understand Israel's role with 9/11. And when I say Israel, obviously that doesn't refer to every single individual in Israel or their entire government. It's a compartmentalized mechanism within it. The Mossad most likely being the group that pulls a lot of those strings. But that being said, you know what he said to me when I brought up 9/11, Joshua?
What did he say?
He knew exactly what I was talking about, and he was game for it. He actually went on my website and sent me an email later that day after he got a chance to check out my stuff. And he said, yeah, man, Building 7, absolutely that thing was demolished. So I thought that was pretty cool, that I too kind of compartmentalized the two different groups in my mind. But when I talked to him and I saw that he was open to this, and not only open to it, he was aware of it for the most part, I was quite encouraged. Anyways, Joshua, we got to take a quick break again, but we'll come back with more, a lot of fascinating stuff with our special guest tonight, Joshua Blakeney. Don't go anywhere, folks. It's the Bob Tuskin Show. As usual, I post about Israel on a daily basis. Stephen Lenneman writes extensively for us at bobtuskin.com on Israel. Happens to be a Jew. Not that it matters. Because people from all over the place see through the human rights violations, and they see through the false flag terrorism. Joshua Blakeney, our guest tonight on the Bob Tuskin Show. Joshua, where would you like to pick it up? Have you been paying attention by chance to what's happening with Iran and the Mossad openly admitting that they took out their weapons guy?
Yeah, I've been listening to things on and off about that. For the last few weeks, I've been fairly busy, with the Occupy movement and also some academic commitments. I went to Occupy Vancouver, where people can see on YouTube my video, Joshua Blakeney Speaks at Occupy Vancouver, which went viral. And then I was at Occupy Victoria on Vancouver Island, and whilst in Victoria, I did a couple of interviews on TV there. And then at Occupy Calgary, I've been sort of coming and going from there. So basically, the answer to your question is I've been a little bit away from the internet over the last few weeks. But yes, I gather that, there seems to be escalations happening. Some people were alleging that there's a rogue faction in Iran that's collaborating with Israel in order to have weapons, bombs dropped in a certain location in Iran that would provide political capital for both the Likud right and for the mullahs in Iran. I don't know if there's much truth to that, but certainly, as I develop a relationship with the fine people at Press TV, who are, normal human beings like the rest of us. I interviewed Professor Marandi from the University of Tehran the other day. Just the idea that my government might be dropping bombs on my friends now in Iran is quite a devastating prospect. And so we have to do everything in our power to resist a cataclysmic war on Iran. If we thought that the war in Iraq was bad, wait till they attack Iran.
Their army is huge. They have far more advancements in Iran. And, what do you think about their president being a 9/11 truther, from what I understand?
Well, I think it's highly commendable, and it reflects well upon their country that they seem to have more free speech on that issue than in Western countries. In fact, I must say Press TV seems to have a lot more free speech and conflicting viewpoints than the BBC does. But I don't know if people know, your listeners know, Professor Marandi. He's an Iranian professor who was, I believe, born in the United States. He speaks perfect English. And the way he speaks, you really do feel he's speaking from the heart, like, because he'll say the positive side of Iran, the negative side. He says, well, I don't support Ahmadinejad myself, he says. And he seems to be very stable and sure of his opinions. And he offers some very interesting perspectives. And I was watching a debate on Press TV from a few years ago the other day that was between Professor Marandi and a couple of journalists from the UK. And he was describing the BBC Persian service, which makes me particularly ashamed, as someone who was formerly a British taxpayer, that the BBC has this Persian service that they constantly streaming incendiary propaganda into Iran, encouraging the public to come to the streets and overthrow the democratically elected Iranian government, disparaging the leadership in Iran. And so it seems that on many subjects, there's actually a lot more freedom of speech in Iran than there is in the Western media. We wouldn't see any of our political leaders dare speak out the way that President Ahmadinejad does.
Sure.
And I think that it shows a lot of respect for those who were slain on 9/11, that he's willing to draw attention to that big crime, because it's not, of course, just the 3,000 people who were killed on 9/11, but rather all those millions of people in Afghanistan, 4.5 million, in Iraq, 2.3 trillion. This is if you believe Gideon Polier's statistics from the Australian National University. And this is, a significant thing to have political leaders such as Ahmadinejad and President Hugo Chavez and Fidel Castro and Raul Castro, the latter of whom I've seen in person when I was in Cuba, speaking out on this matter, because it has implications for humanity, which is why we're in the business of 9/11 trutherdom, is it not?
Yeah, absolutely. I want to move to Syria in just a moment, but you've piqued my interest. What were you doing in Cuba, and how did you get a chance to meet Raul?
Well, I've always thought of myself as a Marxist. I became class conscious whilst working in a supermarket in England. And so when I entered Professor Hall's class in 2007, I think he felt I was kind of viewing the Cuban Revolution through rose-tinted spectacles. I was kind of romanticizing it. And so he actually happened to have booked a trip to go for May Day, to attend the celebrations on the International Workers' Day in Havana. And so I persuaded my wife and my mother to chip in, and I was able to go to Cuba in 2008, accompany Professor Hall. And there's this wonderful so I went on a worker-to-worker exchange. I actually traveled with the Canadian Postal Workers Union. And so as a result, I had a, VIP tours to various, the hospitals.
Now, let me ask you this. You said that Professor Hall thought you were painting it with sort of a rosy view. Did you know that Fidel Castro worked for Army intelligence here in the U.S.?
Well, I've heard different things. Actually, Fidel Castro happens to be a Jewish individual. I've had someone tell me that I shouldn't like him because of that, which I don't see.
Is he Jewish?
I believe so, yeah.
Yeah, but I can guarantee you, regardless if he's Jewish or not, he's probably not a big fan of Israel.
I don't believe so. No. And in fact, I wish that all Jewish people were communists. I wish everyone was communist, to be honest. I think that the communists used to call the Zionists, the communist Jews used to call the Zionists, in the Russian Empire, they used to call them escapists, because they would say, well, you want to run away and create a ghetto in the Middle East, whereas we communist Jews are internationalists. We want to link arms with other oppressed minorities in the Russian Empire and overthrow our collective oppressor. And so I am quite happy to ally myself and to endorse and support people like Fidel Castro and his brother.
Now, I don't support the figures involved with communism for this reason, because I don't think it's true. Communism, I don't think it's ever been able to flourish. I'm not a communist. I think that this might be a point of contention between you and a lot of our listeners. But I do think it's interesting that Fidel Castro, who was working for our Army intelligence here in the U.S., I had a mentor of mine who was actually living with him in the mountains with Che Guevara, Raul, and his different people. And before the revolution in Cuba, there was very little for the poor there. They had horrible conditions. They had very little sewage and so on. And Fidel actually brought forth a lot of renovations for the people there, which no matter which way you look at it, it's a good thing. Now going over to Libya, it seems that Gaddafi may have done a lot of good for his people as well, but we saw what happened with that situation. Your thoughts on Libya?
Well, I think the comparison between Libya and Cuba, there is a comparison in terms of the non-aligned movement, the anti-colonial struggles that Gaddafi supported and that Fidel supported. But I think there's a big difference between what the Cuban government did in Cuba and in the circumstances of being 90 miles away from the most powerful country on the planet. And they transformed that country, which was a slave society where black people would be locked in on the plantations in Cuba at night, where there was an apartheid system where black people couldn't walk to the beaches in Cuba before 1959. To take that degradation and privation that was bequeathed to the revolutionary government and to make a country that has one of the best healthcare systems in the world. The other day I saw the Canadian media boasting that the country that you're third most likely to survive breast cancer in is Canada, because we have a pretty good healthcare system here. But they didn't mention the first on that list was Cuba. The infant mortality rate is lower in Cuba than it is in the United States, and the life expectancy until 1990 was longer, and it's just about to come abreast again with the United States' life expectancy. And so you're less likely to die if you're a baby born in Cuba than the United States, and you have about the same life expectancy. Education from infancy to PhD is free. These are all human rights too. So we often hear about human rights, but medicine is free in Cuba. Everyone has a ration book so they don't starve. If you compare that to any other country that was formerly in the Spanish Empire, Guatemala, I was in Havana at like 3 o'clock in the morning walking back to my hotel from the barrios, having spent time with, Cuban families. And they're as safe as you could expect. I wouldn't do that in Guatemala City or in Sao Paulo, but I do that in Havana. It's a quite different country, especially considering it's been surrounded by U.S. U-boats, just as when Britain was surrounded by U-boats in World War II, we had no human rights. In Britain in World War II, my island was surrounded by U-boats, you would be hung on the spot if you proselytized for the opponents, for Hitler. We didn't have elections during the whole of World War II because we were in a siege mentality. Likewise, the Cuban government has had terrorist attacks meted out in Cuba by the CIA. They tried to blow up Fidel Castro's cigars and poison his wetsuits and do everything, as people who've seen the documentary 600 Ways to Kill Castro will attest.
All right, let's pick that up. Let's pick that up. Sorry to interrupt, Joshua. Sorry to interrupt, but I have to. Let's pick that up in just a moment, and we'll. All right, Joshua, we have a question from our chat room at bobtuskin.com. They ask, why is it that Cuban people risk their lives sailing over shark-infested waters in makeshift vessels in attempt at life in the USA? That's something that the pro-Cuban, the anti-Castro people, rather, bring up often, and I'll let you respond to that.
Well, it's a very small minority, and anyone who's watching Cindy Sheehan's trips to and from Cuba at the moment and seeing how Cindy Sheehan is being criminalized in the United States, I can't help wondering whether she might be fleeing the other way soon from the United States to Cuba. And so I think evidently this is a canard that's brought out, just as I wanted to emigrate from England to Canada for a different lifestyle. But many people, like my sister, for example, wanted to stay in Britain. So some people don't like the Cuban Revolution. That doesn't in any way diminish the totems and achievements of that revolution. As I say, universal education from infancy to PhD, free healthcare, free medicine. The death penalty doesn't exist in Cuba since I was there. It was, when Raul ascended, that was over. And in fact, they hadn't even executed anyone for like over a decade. And that guy that they had executed a decade previously had been smuggling in heroin into the ports in Cuba. There's no drug problems in Cuba. It's obviously got the traits of a country that's under siege, that's there's a U.S. consulate in Havana that has a black flag erected for each and every terrorist attack that the U.S. has done on Cuba, and the whole street is laden with these black flags for all the terrorist attacks that the U.S. has done. You think during the Cold War, when the U.S. was destroying and sabotaging countries in Indochina that were many, many thousands of miles away from the United States, and yet this little island 90 miles away from the behemoth imperialist country was able to establish these social safety nets that many in the United States would find enviable. In Cuba, they elect their parliament. I've met representatives of the Cuban parliament, and in fact, whereas in our society we have this abstract job called a politician who's disconnected from the economy, or at the very best, if they are connected to the economy, they're plutocrats, they're capitalists. In Cuba, the lady I had dinner with, for example, was elected by the teachers. So it's kind of like the trade union leader is the politician in Cuba. And so there's a direct connection between the working class and those who are elected to parliament. And she was telling me about, for example, they had a storm in Cuba and how she could fast track funds and resources to rebuild their school and even get a solar panel on top of her school as a result of the lack of bureaucracy. So we're often told communism is bureaucratic, but in fact, because the working class are electing those who sit in the representative assembly in Cuba, there's actually less bureaucracy and more democracy in many ways. And that's in spite of the fact they've been blockaded, sabotaged, had subterfuge meted out upon them. And so I have no hesitation in saying I think the Cuban Revolution will go down in history as one of the greatest achievements of humanity. Of course, Cuba didn't start off in 1959 with a Western liberal democracy where everyone it had a car and 2.4 children and electric fridges with rump steaks inside them. Cuba was a slave society in which there was mass poverty and privation and misery, and in just half a century they've turned that into a fairly decent society, all things considered. Moreover, Cuba is one of the only countries in history to ever have waged a war that was against its interests, that defied the Soviet Union. As anyone who's read the book Conflicting Missions, Cuba, America and the Soviet Union, all the documentary record indicates that Cuba went to support the black Africans who were resisting Portuguese and US and British and Belgium and French imperialism, different forms of encroachment in Africa and Southern Africa, especially in Angola. They supported those resisting the encroachments of the racist white apartheid mercenaries who were going into Angola. I think something like 15,000 Cubans died to fight in a war which seemed to be moralistic. The only incentive could have been they defied the Soviet Union, they defied the American empire, they took risks, they depleted their military, all to help defeat the racist outpost of imperialism in the south of Africa, which is why Nelson Mandela, one of his first trips he did once he became president was to Cuba, was to thank them for the dedication and support that they gave when everyone else in the world was abandoning the ANC and calling them terrorists. I think many people in the US would be lucky to go to Cuban hospitals and would be fortunate to have a social safety net that Cubans have.
Yeah.
And so we can't just measure wealth as if it's always expressed in how many dollars we have in our pocket. Wealth can be expressed in multiple ways, one of which is how we have wealth collectively.
Or how happy we are and how we have food and the ability to sustain ourselves. And one final thought, and I hate to cut you off here, but I don't want to digress too much on Cuba, although I think it's fascinating, and we may have a different opinion on some of it, but I do think that it's quite compelling what they did during the special period in the 1990s where the Soviet Union and their oil supplies was cut off to Cuba. They were forced to grow a lot of their food in Cuba, and the city of Havana became one of the largest producers of food in the world, one of the largest cities to produce so much of their food. A fascinating instance where they took permaculture and some of the things that we talk about and applied it to their country. And because of that, although at first it was very hard and many people were starving, they in the long run will be better off because they're not dependent on the powers that shouldn't be. And
can I make one other point, Bob?
Sure, one last point.
Let's contrast what happened in New Orleans with what happens in Cuba every year. Every year a hurricane strikes Cuba, and 0 people died because of the collective model they have in Cuba, where the people work collaboratively to mobilize, to solve the problems that are wrought upon Cuba by these hurricanes, which could be coming from HARP, type weapons, who knows. Whereas in New Orleans, the most affluent country on the planet, couldn't pick up its dead bodies in the street that were floating in the street 3 weeks after they died. It's quite a contrast between the individualistic model in the US and the collectivist model in Cuba, where nobody dies each year because of hurricanes.
Interesting. All right, we are going to open up the phone lines next hour with Joshua. 866-841-1065. That's 866-841-1065. And in the final moments before we reach the bottom of their hour here, the top of the hour here, is there anything that you want to get to or that you want to plug before we take a quick break again and then come back for hour number 2?
Well, I think people would probably benefit from seeing this video of my friend, my First Nations friend. She's a Native American girl getting viciously hurled in the back of a police car. If they go to YouTube and write, my name is Occuduck, OCCU-DUCK. My name is Occuduck. They can see my friend, brave comrade Sarah Scout, who's been erected a teepee in downtown Calgary as part of Occupy Calgary, being hurled in a van for what seems to be the crime of speaking in her native tongue, which it seems rather reprehensible. All right,
when we come, let's see if I can speak straight. When we come back, we'll talk about that a little bit as well. 866-841-1065, the number to join us. We're talking with Joshua Blakeney. You may not agree with him. Well, this is your opportunity to call in. 866-841-1065. It's the Bob Tuskin Show. Join us. Hour number 2 still to come. All right, get out your crayons. I expect to hear from you. 866-841-1065. Joshua Blakeney, our special guest tonight. Joshua, do you have any websites that you'd like to plug?
Yeah, my website is joshuablakeney.info. joshuablakeney.info. And I recently did a couple of TV appearances on Vancouver Island where I really went in depth into the origins of the war on terror and the Israeli aspect of that. One is Joshua Blakeney Face to Face, if you just type in that on YouTube.
I saw that.
And the other one is Joshua Blakeney on Chris Cook's Guerrilla Radio.
Very cool. Well, we'll pick it up with Joshua Blakeney in just a moment. Lots to talk about. Don't go anywhere, folks. Hour number 2 still to come.
Welcome to the Bob Tuskin Radio Show with your host, Bob Tuskin.
All right, it's the hour number 2 of the Bob Tuskin Show. We're talking with Joshua Blakeney. We're going to bring up some more about geopolitical stuff. We'll talk about Israel, and we'll talk about whatever else Josh has on his mind. But as promised, we will open up the phone lines at 866-841-1065. That's toll free. Get out your crayon, write that down. I do want to hear from you. 866-841-1065. Josh, what do you say we take a call?
Okay, let's go for it, bro.
Are you brave enough?
Yeah, I can do it. I can take on
these
smart American people.
We're all so smart, you know that? The rest of the world.
Actually, it's quite a stereotype in the UK and stuff that Americans aren't clever, but
that's a stereotype all around the world.
I seldom meet a stupid American. I usually meet very educated and smart and intelligent and forthright people from the United States.
You're going to get in trouble. Here we go. Let's go to Arizona in the United States. Go ahead, caller. What's on your mind?
Hey, Bob. It's Buzz. How's it going?
I'm doing well. Go ahead.
So you just banned me a minute ago, and I'd like to know why. I didn't cause any trouble in there.
Okay, well, we're in the middle of a show right now, and if you'd like to talk about that, email me at the website, bobtuskin.com. Let's go to Madison in California. Madison, how are you tonight?
Good. How are you, Bob?
Doing well, man. Have you heard some of the show? What's on your mind?
Yes, I've been listening, and I heard him talking about, the Cubans' involvement in Africa, and I was just wondering, he mentioned, them fighting back against the racist white colonialists. and I was wondering how he reconciles the virulent racism of Che Guevara, as revealed in his own words.
Well, I've never come across any racism from Che Guevara. As far as I can see, he was the personification of internationalism, of anti-racism. This is a man who came from a fairly middle-class background, who was among the caste in Latin America, who, due to ethnic reasons, basically due to the shade of their skin, had privilege. And he went around Latin America saying, we're all mestizo, we're all basically a mixture of Indian and white, and we should transcend ethnic and racial parochialism. His credo was, we are all mestizo, and therefore he's a man who went to Congo to fight with African people who he'd never met, simply to help them liberate themselves from the shackles of imperialism. Would you
exactly. I'm talking about his experience in the Congo. He actually talked about the Africans in some of the most racist language I've ever heard. I mean, he talked about them being so inherently stupid and incredibly incapable of even handling weapons properly, understanding military movements, all this kind of stuff. He was really frustrated with the fact that they weren't, the people he's working with had no experience in, bloody revolution or militarism. And you can read it in his own writings that, got published after he died, or, he was assassinated. I actually used to, be in your camp, I'd say, until I did some more deep research on Che, and I came to the conclusion that essentially he still harbors the same racist tendencies that so many people who claim to not be racist actually do.
Very interesting, and of course Che Guevara is on many of T-shirts as a symbol of rebellion. Hey Madison, hold that thought. I'd like to bring you back with Joshua Blakeney, our guest tonight on tonight's Bob Tuskin Show. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back after these. All right, Joshua, I did not mean to digress too much on the topic of Cuba and communism and that kind of thing, but I do think it's interesting to get a different perspective than what we're used to here on the show. So if you will, I'd like to allow Madison to come back on and ask whatever final questions he has, and then we'll move on to some more of the geopolitical stuff, which we agree on 100% when it comes to Israel and what's going on with 9/11, the root of the war on terror as we know it today. I think we're all on the same page, including Madison from endthelie.com. Madison, go ahead. What else did you want to ask Joshua?
Yeah, I just wanted to say I'm not trying to denigrate your guest in any way. I've actually listened to an interview with him on the past on, I believe it was called Guerrilla Radio or something. It was a Canadian show. But I was on board 100% until he, started getting into the support of communism. But I was just wondering what your moral stance is in terms of relativism, absolutism, or pragmatism, because I think to accept Che Guevara and these types of people, you have to either be a relativist or a pragmatist in order to accept that killing other human beings is okay as long as it's what you think is for what you think is a good cause. And that's where I just can't get on board. I don't see it as being any different than the people who are in power now who think 3,000 people on September 11th is just a cost of doing business, to bring about the second stage and, the war on terror and the whole Homeland Security apparatus. So I was just wondering what his stance is morally.
I think you raised some very profound points, Madison, and I thank you for them. I think the interface between relativism and absolutism is really the big question of our era. We're living in a very relativistic period of history where it seems there's no such thing as truth, that there's no absolute coherent ideology on the left. There's a great deal of moral relativism, which has aided and abetted those who want to do the war on terror. A number of things that you said weren't quite true. To go to Congo and risk your life and try to help the people resist colonialism and then to be frustrated with the extreme superstitions that the people had there. Indeed, the religion they had stated that if they got shot by a bullet, that it would bounce off them if they did certain prayers. And so when Che was trying to, mobilize and train these foot soldiers to resist imperialism, and they were thinking that bullets would bounce off them, and therefore they didn't really have to take what he was saying seriously, evidently that would have been frustrating. That's not racist. That's just perhaps somewhat ethnocentric, but it could be a moral ethnocentrism, And I do believe that when we look at what's happened to Congo, where 10 million Congolese have died, at least, since then, that we have to say, well, if Che had somehow managed to mobilize and organize them to resist imperialism, to express self-determination, that would have been moral and just. And I do think that it's a shame on the left to have this extreme relativism that almost becomes a nihilism, where we can't offer palliatives to other people in case we're being ethnocentric. If you went to Guatemala, to a Mayan village, and someone had a headache and you gave them an aspirin for their headache, you wouldn't feel like you were being ethnocentric. But yet we're told when people come from other countries to offer palliatives for people's societal problems, that's not allowed anymore. That's ethnocentric or paternalistic. And I disagree with that. I think Che Guevara was evidently an extreme anti-racist, a man who, as I say, he left relative privilege and affluence in Argentina as a doctor, where he could have had an okay life, and risked his life for humanity. He went around encouraging people to transcend the kind of parochialism and difference that's celebrated by postmodern anthropologists and scholars these days. I think that if you look at the record, him getting frustrated with the extreme irrational, let's be honest, superstition that's contributed to the divide and rule policies that's allowed the imperialist countries to divide and rule and pit the Congolese tribes against each other, which has left 10 million of them dead. That's a big Holocaust, 10 million of them dead. I think in hindsight, Che Guevara is vindicated on that point, and that Madison's valid but inaccurate.
Okay, I would tell you to read his own words, what he actually said about the Congolese people. Okay, I mean, I
read his Congolese diary, actually, quite in depth, actually.
Yes, that's what I'm talking about, actually. I just don't know how you can come away with that with anything other than, a kind of, the most positive thing I could take away from it is that he was condescending, and ethnocentric, if not racist. He just, believed that's one aspect of communism that I can't get on board with, is the internationalist bent of kind of erasing cultures. I'm not the type of person that thinks anyone should have to give up their culture to be, part of the international community.
But culture and ethnicity, unfortunately, has been exploited to such an extent by the imperialist powers that Marxists say one has to prioritize economic democracy and economic self-determination first and foremost. And, what happened in South Africa, for example, where political apartheid ended, but that now the pendulum swung the other way, actually, and there's been no economic democracy in South Africa. We see what happens when we employ this kind of postmodern politics. The same thing with Barack Obama, when, he's the postmodern president, right, where he came to power and everyone said it's a post-racial era, but he does nothing to address the legitimate concerns of all working class people, of all cultures, all creeds, all colors, and so on. A rich black woman has a lot more privilege and dignity than a poor white man. And I think it's best for us, if we want to improve our world, resist imperialism, and create an equitable economic order, for us to cherish a certain cultural heritage that we have, but prioritize the universalist thrust of Marxism, prioritize the economic reality that the planet's divided between those who own capital and those who produce capital, and that actually a carpenter from Guatemala and a carpenter from the Congo and a carpenter from Texas have a lot more in common than they have in difference. And for this postmodern ethos that we go around emphasizing and celebrating our differences has led us into this quagmire where humanity's fighting each other. Remember that the Al-Qaeda bogeyman replaced the communist bogeyman of the Cold War, that the way that you're talking about communists is the way that we've now been encouraged to talk about Al-Qaeda and Muslims. And a lot of disinformation was spread in the Cold War. The Church Committee found that 5,000 university professors and 3,000 journalists were working with the CIA to spread disinformation against those who sought economic democracy, economic self-determination. And if someone comes from Argentina via Cuba to the Congo to help them get self-determination, economic self-determination, he fails, and then 10 million of them die as a result of the kind of ethnic sectarianism that that Che Guevara was criticizing. I can't then turn around and say that Che Guevara was wrong, because I don't think he was. I think if you read what he said, he was criticizing the extreme superstitions that led the tribes that he was working with to think that bullets would bounce off them, which led him to conclude that he was wasting his time, risking his life, when he would be better off helping those who actually might get their act together or be at a stage of psychological...
Okay, Joshua, quick break. Don't mean to cut you off. Quick break. We'll be right back. Don't go anywhere. All right, Joshua, I was hoping we could shift gears a little bit here, but we're going to continue to take calls as long as we have them on the Bob Tuskin Show. 866-841-1065 is the toll-free number to join us. Get out your clan. I want to hear from you. 866-841-1065. Madison, you wanted to wrap things up, and then we'll get to a few other callers here. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, about the mysterious terrorist boogeyman replacing the communist boogeyman, it's very true. But one thing that we have on our side nowadays is the internet and the free spread of information. And, he was saying that it came out in the church committee that, there was a network essentially of assets pumping out anti-communist propaganda, which is very true. And we couldn't really know exactly how many warheads they had and all this stuff, so we kind of had to trust, the so-called authorities. But nowadays, it's demonstrable that terrorism is not nearly as dangerous and nearly as big of a threat as people make it out to be. More people die suffocating in their bed at night accidentally than die from terrorism every year, And so that's one thing that we have on our side nowadays, is that we can point to the facts and the statistics that say, look, this is fear-mongering, this threat is overblown, you really shouldn't, think that terrorists are around every corner trying to blow you up. So I just wanted to add that we have, that we have information on our side nowadays. So thanks, and have a good one, Bob.
Thank you, Madison. Appreciate your call. Joshua, would you like to respond to that?
No, I think Madison, made a good point there, and I actually think he came across in a very articulate way, and it was good to agree on some points and disagree on others, and I'd like to speak to him again.
Isn't it fun when you can do that? Madison's a pretty good writer. You may have seen his website, End the Lie. We post some of his articles on the Intel Hub and BobTuskin.com. So yeah, I hope people that listen can look at ideas into themselves and not just generalize and, take one portion that they may agree or disagree with and therefore say that the rest of it's garbage without judging it for the merits of it unto itself. Anyways, let's go back to the phone lines as long as we have callers here at 866-841-1065. John in Canada, go ahead, sir.
Hi, gentlemen. Yeah, I unfortunately missed the beginning of the show, and I've just caught maybe the last 15 minutes, but boy, I know this Joshua is an awesome person, and just the fact that he's got such a wonderful command of the English language. But I felt that there was something I wanted to take up with him on when he's talking about economic self-determination. If we want just that, economic self-determination, we're going to have to live in a society that's civilized. Now, when he's talked about the left and right tards in America, especially the libertarian, are just the very worst, and the Republicans, the very worst of everything we've associated bad with communism. They want the public option for themselves, but not for the public. The public must suffer and die. They get special treatment. And they follow ideologies, rules, like privatize always, the government's always bad, and they're scum of the earth who always champion censorship to not allow the mathematics and the science to prevail. And I feel that that's only the thing that I might find something to discuss with Joshua about is that the so-called left ideology is just everybody else who can think for themselves. You know, we have standards of civilization that say you need evidence to form a guilty verdict, but the rightards in America say we don't need any evidence. We're going to use the argument of terrorism and just bomb indiscriminately everybody in Iraq for no cause. You know, there's no reason to bomb Iraq because we had unrestricted access to go wherever we please. Again, it's a thinking man's game. They don't like the thinking men or thinking women communicating the facts to determine for ourselves what is factual, because the liars and the cheats and the thieves fall when free communication rule. And I don't call that left wing. I just call that the civilized people. You know, Hammurabi, the first law of all civilization, says, look, if you've got no evidence with your capital allegation against another individual, you're just immediately put to death. You know, if you say Bin Laden did 9/11 and you give us no evidence as to how he put explosives into World Trade Center 7, you're stealing faith of the illiterate masses who don't know or can't even think for themselves and have to go by some form of faith in one degree or another. And you're the true enemy when you make capital allegations and not form them with the facts. But, you know, as your last caller, it seemed pretty cool, but, you know, suggesting that they were racist for fighting on behalf of Africans when, as you've articulated too, that apartheid was supported by America and by Israel. You know, the last thing that Israel wants is free black people to rule, such as the Jews in Ethiopia who are the founding.
Well, that's exactly right. The Ethiopians are discriminated against in Israel and treated like second-hand citizens to the supreme Ashkenazi Jews that have gone into Israel. Joshua, your comments on that?
Well, it's very interesting. Of course, there has been this tendency on the left sometimes to also sacrifice truth and sometimes sacrifice justice in the name of ideology. And so the left isn't squeaky clean on this. And the problem is when you analyze capitalism and you realize that 9 out of 10 laws exist to protect private property, 9 out of 10 laws are unjust, and you only get the occasional law, like in Canada we have the Crimes Against Humanity and War Crimes Act, which in my view is a just set of laws. And so the left has been guilty of, flouting the law, etc. I think Madison did have a point when he was kind of saying that, communism, it's an absolute, it's kind of self-righteous, it's kind of paternalistic. You go into a context and tell people like Mayan Indians or something like, oh, you're backward and we need to raise your consciousness and bring you out of the kind of backwardness that you're living in and teach you the correct way that we know. And so you can see how many would argue that that's kind of ethnocentric. But then you look at the way that many tribal peoples have been decimated and have fought one another and killed one another because of ethnic obscurantism and ethnic parochialism. One cannot help wondering whether helping people to be universal and form, pan identities. In Canada, for example, we're always fragmented into our different provinces. Why can't we have a pan-Canadian identity or pan-European identity? Or in Latin America, they're trying to do the Bolivarian revolution. I think only through universalism can we succeed. And you don't have to believe me on that. You can just look at China. One of the first things Mao Zedong did and the Chinese Communist Party did was say we're going to have one language, Mandarin, that everyone in China is going to learn. Because
let me ask you something here. Was that before or after they slaughtered 20 million people?
Well, they didn't slaughter 20 million people. There was a famine due to poor agricultural planning in China, right? I mean, and
what about the Chinese Communist Party's crimes against humanity with the Falun Gong and Falun Dafa? Have you followed that at all?
Well, as I indicate, I'm not really into this kind of postmodern, politics where we stand up for, because I mean, this cultural politics, this emphasis on cultural and religious politics, it invariably serves the interest of the imperialist countries, as is exhibited by those who constantly pine for the Tibetans, for the Dalai Lama, who himself is a CIA agent. I'm into economic justice. The Communist Party in China lifted 500 million people out of poverty. 500 million people were living in poverty in a kind of semi-feudal society. And thanks to the policies of the Communist Party in China, no government in history has ever lifted 500 million people out of poverty, liberated women.
As great as that sounds, Joshua, and I don't mean to interrupt, but as great as that sounds, I do think we need to look at the genocides that have taken place in the process, and we should not neglect this. Yeah, it might be taken out of proportion by the Western media, but still, it's important to look at. Anyways, we keep on going down that road, and I'd like to move on here and talk about a few other things, but we got to take another quick break, unfortunately. So when we come back, we'll take some more phone calls. 866-841-1065. Steve Stars might pop on for a moment with Joshua Blakeney, our special guest tonight, and your calls in just a moment. Mike Anthony's on the line. John, thank you for your call, and more in just seconds. Don't go anywhere. Okay, we do have open lines at 866-841-1065. Yes, tonight, Joshua Blakeney, and we've been taking phone calls for the second hour. If you want to hear from you, get out your crayon, write down this number, 866-841-1065. Josh, are you daring enough to go back to the phone lines with me?
Okay, let's go for it.
All right, you're a brave man. Here we go. Mike Anthony's on the line. Mike, how are you tonight?
Hey, good evening, Bob. Doing well. Thanks for taking my call. Hi, Josh. I want to make a couple points regarding the communist approach to governing a country and a people. But my comments first regarding you say that it was just a natural starvation, food shortage that caused at least 50 or 100 million Chinese to die. And I guess that's just a coincidence like the Bolsheviks did to the Russian people when they took over. Just a natural starvation. They didn't cut them off from food. They didn't go in and shoot all their livestock and burn down the fields. No, it was just nature denied them to harvest anything for, 7 years, 10 years straight, and they all died from starvation naturally?
Well, no, I said poor agricultural planning policies. The intention was to increase agricultural output and increase industrial output in order for the communist countries to catch up with the capitalist countries who were trying to sabotage their revolutions, who were trying to reinstall reactionary dictators and monarchs, and the whites in the case of Russia, the Kuomintang in the case of China. And so the attempts to resist imperialism forced them to take extreme, radical, quick processes of industrialization, I guess is the word I'm looking for. They needed to expedite their industrialization. And so in China, they melted down the steel and encouraged all those folk in the agricultural hinterland to melt down their steel in order to expedite industrialization. And as a result, when tractors broke down, they didn't have replacement parts. So the intention was moral. The goal was not, it wasn't like the capitalist countries who preconceive a genocide, like they send death squads into El Salvador and Guatemala armed with U.S. guns, or in the case of the Middle East, armed with Israeli guns.
Joshua,
they're sending death squads in, like they're doing in Syria right now. Where in the case of the communist countries, the intention was to increase the standard of living of the greatest amount of people, and they implemented those policies within the context of inheriting a semi-feudal, backward society that had been ravaged by the imperialist countries. They didn't inherit a liberal democracy where everyone had a nice Ford car and an electric fridge in their house.
Mike, go ahead.
Mike. So you're saying that the capitalists over here that are causing all that are really capitalists, right? That's another part of the big lie. They're Bolshevik communist Jews that financed Lenin and Stalin, called Rockefellers. You got the Warburgs. I've got photographs of some of their agents over and bringing up the young Mao Zedong, Israel Epstein, Sidney Shapiro, who's still on the Chinese Communist Politburo to this day. Oh, but we keep that quiet. Along with Alan Rice, who also was helping Lenin out previously before this incident with the communists in China.
I wish that every single Jew would embrace proletarian internationalism and reject ethnic obscurantism of Zionism, a quasi-fascist ideology that's destroying our planet. I wish that all Jews were communists. The communist Jews used to laugh at the Zionist Jews and call them escapists who were going to the Middle East to create their ghetto and
they're
escape
the guys
rather
that
than
financed your heroes, Joshua.
The Russian Empire and
they're the guys that financed your heroes.
Collective oppressor. I wish all Jews would embrace proletarian internationalism like they used to.
Okay, well, I just want to ask you one more question. So, with your communist approach for a country's development, let me ask you this: do you use a cell phone? Do you use
working class people innovated?
Hold on.
Yeah, I have
if I may, I don't want to drag this out. There may be other callers. I'm just going to be real succinct with the yes and no's. Do you use a cell phone? Do you use a computer? Do you drive a car?
All the things were made by working class people I enjoy, yes.
All those are made by people in a country that had some semblance of freedom. That was Europe and the United States. Didn't come from Africa, didn't come from China, didn't come from South America. Came from Europe and America,
well,
my friend.
Where did the rubber for your
these are the continents under big attack right now, where any freedom that they had are being rapidly eliminated.
Wait a second, Mike. One at a time, okay? Now's your chance to respond, Joshua. Go ahead.
Well, he said that those accessories, such as having a cell phone or having a car, solely came from non-African countries. That's not true. Coltan comes from the Congo, that every cell phone requires to function. The rubber of my tires probably came from Indonesia and was made by working class people in Indonesia.
All right.
The car would have been assembled by working class people in Canada.
All right, I see your point.
Working class people produce everything. The only problem being the profit goes to an elite that sits on their necks, you know?
Well,
but Josh, that's a raw material that was developed by Western minds in countries that had some type of freedom of thought. They were allowed to present their ideas and develop things. In communist countries, there's no competition at all. That's how we're going here now, you know, no competition. Now, for example, and lastly, because I just want to make some points and not tie you guys up. So Cuba, so great, and they had their own medical for everybody and stuff like that. Now all that medical, my friend, is all modern Western medicine, which is all crap. Pharmaceuticals. Where are they getting that from? Are they making that there at home through botanicals?
Yeah,
no.
Actually, they do make pharmaceuticals in the University of Havana. In fact, they invented a cure for meningitis, and now the Western countries are buying that patent off Cuba.
Okay,
so they're innovating and helping all of humanity.
Okay, good. So you have some innovation, and that's going on everywhere with chemistry labs, but most of their pharmaceuticals was Western. And my only point regarding that is it's all flawed. That's as bad as what we have here, my friend, because I know how to cure cancer for nothing practically. And any other disease, you name it, I've cured it, and real fast, real quick, and real cheap.
Hey, Mike, well, that sounds
science.
like the topic of a whole different show. Hey, give me a call or an email sometime. As you know, we're very much interested in the health topics here on the Bob Tuskin Show, which, by the way, this week is going to be our World AIDS Fraud Week. World AIDS Day is coming up on Thursday, so the lamestream media is pumping their propaganda rampant through the airwaves, and we're going to combat that with an honest look at the HIV fraud. Steve Stars will be joining us here in just a moment for a final look at the Military Detention Act. That's not what it's called. It's the Military Indefinite Detention Act, the absolutely draconian bill that was just passed in the Senate today. If you have not heard yet, our guest is Joshua Blakeney. And here in the final moments of this segment, I'll let John chime in real quick here, John, for a minute, and then I'll let Joshua respond, and we'll try to squeeze any other phone calls we have in just a moment with our last segment. John, go ahead real quick, please, sir.
Oh, thanks for the rebuttal, man. Listen, Susan Day wrote a book called How the Other Half Dies. 78% of starvation is caused in countries that have food surpluses. We don't have the intelligence. We're not caring enough to hear wise people speak. UN has a Declaration of Human Rights, universal. It's the most beautiful thing ever. It's never enforced. Ban Ki-moon does not tell us that Gaddafi isn't in violation of 1441. Or 1976, and Saddam Hussein isn't in violation of 1441. He's a war criminal. Communist China did not defend our rights to the Universal Declaration. These papers mean nothing. The World Bank has the same thing. We won't harm anybody, and all they do every day is ruthlessly and relentlessly deprive the rights of innocent others. Freedom is justice. If we're going to treat people unfairly, we're doing a tyrannical, unjust, ungodly act. We need the freedom to believe in God also, which is an important part of communist China. Yeah, okay, thanks, buddy.
Thanks, John. Okay, fair enough. John's got a lot of energy in him. All right, Joshua, go ahead and respond.
Well, I think he hit the nail on the head when he said there's no enforcement, and what Che Guevara tried to do and died for all of us in the process of doing was enforce justice, was to enforce morality and attempt to educate people. In Cuba, they have a cliche, education is liberation. You know, to educate people how to accurately analyze their subjective circumstances in relation to the capitalist class in order for them to liberate themselves from the shackles of imperialism and capitalism. And so it is the lack of enforcement. We have lofty principles and lofty declarations in Canada and in the international arena, but none of them are enforced. And it got to a stage in Cuba, the rule of law had broken down, the political system was so corrupt that a handful of people took a ship across from Mexico, the Granma, and then a few of them survived and took off to about 81 of them came across on the ship, and a handful survived and took off to the Sierra Maestra, because that was a last resort. And one would hope that the lofty laws that we have, the declarations we have, can be enforced. I hope they are. No one wants bloody revolution. That's the last thing I want. But that lack of enforcement is what Che Guevara was reacting to. And as for our other friend, the fact is that everything I have in my house is produced by working class people. The difference is, whereas a working class person can make shoes in a shoe factory, he might walk home barefooted himself, for example, in Indonesia.
And even worse, we have, sorry to interrupt, but we're coming up to a break, and even worse, Josh, machines are taking the place of a lot of the useless eaters, goyim's labor. All right, final segment still to come here in just moments. It's the Bob Tuskin Show. Final phone calls here. Sid in Indiana, you're on with Joshua Blakeney.
Hey, how are you guys today?
Doing well, Sid. Go ahead.
Hey, look, hey, Joshua, a really great show, and I really appreciate Bob having you as a guest. Really nice listening to intelligent conversation. You don't always get that. Not all the hosts care about it. It's a hard thing to wake up and constantly have to reassess the stories that you were told as you were getting your education. But here we are at it's 10 o'clock my time and at night, and I do this every night and every day. It's important. I'm going to leave it at that. I just wanted to give you kudos, man, and tell you thanks.
Thank you, Sid.
You got a guy that's coming up behind me waiting, and he wants to ask you some important stuff, and I want to hear what he has to ask you. So,
right. Very
so I'm going to yield.
Very considerate of you to yield, and appreciate the kind words. And we'll go to Kevin in Minnesota to finish things off. Sid wanted you to speak up, Kevin. You have about a minute or so in the final moments of the show to do so. Go ahead, Kevin.
Well, thank you very much. Quite an interesting show this evening. The one thing that I wanted to bring up is, through all of my research on all of these governments, they've all been created for one purpose only: to protect those that govern. If they can keep us waving the blue flag or the red flag or the white flag and touting our government as being the one, then they can constantly keep us divided.
Divided and conquered.
True freedom is within one's soul. Look at Thomas Paine when he brought up the whole word of utopia was based upon his existence with the Native Americans of the North American continent.
Hello, Kevin. Good points there. And Joshua, we only have about a minute or so left. Your response?
All these criticism of the communist republics, blunders and the occasional crimes that they did, we have to remember that the republic that Thomas Paine inspired wasn't very amicable towards the Native Americans. In the Declaration of Independence, your Declaration of Independence says that King George did bring on the merciless Indian savages, whose no means of warfare is the undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions, defined the first terrorists, you might say, in this war on terror that began in 1776, and that was because, King George III in the Royal Proclamation of 1763 had actually said they weren't going to do genocidal expansion when going westward, but rather do treaty making, which is far more reasonable. And of course, the United States Republic was founded. All the states that came into existence to the west of the Ohio Valley were built on the bones of the native inhabitants who lived there. And so just as the U.S. came out of a revolutionary period and there was lots of carnage and bloodshed, likewise, the revolutions that emerged out of the slave society that was in Cuba, the semi-feudal society that was in China, it wasn't a bed of roses at first. But I think that when anyone looks at China, you'd have to be blind and mad to not say that the Communist Party has done a great deal of good for the Chinese people.
All right, we'll have to talk about that on some more on another show, but unfortunately we're just flat out of time. Josh, real quick, one more time, your website, and thanks again for coming on. I'd like to have you on again to talk about Israel and some of the geopolitical stuff some more. I know we got kind of off on a tangent tonight, but that's okay. I think it was a fruitful conversation. JoshuaBlakeney.info is my website, and I'm really grateful for you having me on, Bob, and really, I think you seem to have a wonderful show going on and a very educated listenership. I agree. Thanks so much, Josh. Take care.
Today, at least dating the movies after the Rothschilds, Warburgs, and Rockefellers robbed the American economy. Many of us have some understanding of